Welcome to This Week Health IT Influence, where we discuss the influence of technology on health with the people who are making it happen. My name is Bill Russell, not the original recovering healthcare CIO, but one of the recovering healthcare CIOs, and the creator of This Week in Health IT, a set of podcasts and videos dedicated to developing the next generation of health IT leaders. This podcast is sponsored by Health Lyrics. Professional athletes have coaches for every aspect of their life to improve performance, yet many CIOs and health executives choose to go it alone. Technology is taking center stage for healthcare. Get a coach in your corner. Visit healthlyrics.com to schedule your free consultation. Two new free services on our website to make the listeners aware of This Week in Health Insights, or This Week Health Insights for individuals looking to propel your health IT career forward. 2 emails a week designed to give you insights that set you apart. And then the second is This Week Health Staff Meeting is for teams. This is for managers looking to introduce your team to new thinking from industry leaders and to get the conversation for your staff meeting started on the right foot. All right. So today we're joined by Michael Hamilton, one of the founders of CI Security. Good morning, Mike, and welcome to the show.
Hey, Bill. Thanks, and happy to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to talk.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. We had a brief conversation before we hit record, and I think it's going to be exciting. So some of our listeners may not be familiar with your background. You're the one of the founders of CI Security. Maybe the best way to go about this is to say, why did what in your experience made you found a cybersecurity company?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And honestly, it's not just a company. It's a company with a real mission focus. And, I spent the last 10 years about working in government as a policy advisor to Governor Inslee here in Washington State through the Office of the CIO. I was the Chief of Information Security for the City of Seattle for almost 8 years. Been the Vice Chair of a Homeland Security Government Coordinating Council for state, local, tribal, and territorial infrastructure protection. But before that, I spent about, my information security career goes about 30 years back. I spent a goodly amount of time as a consultant and eventually was the managing consultant for VeriSign Global Security Consulting. And when I made the transition from working nearly exclusively in the private sector with Fortune corporations, and then went over to have a look and become the CISO of the City of Seattle, when I looked around and I saw the criticality of things that are supported by your local government in particular, water purification, waste treatment, public health services, traffic management, all these things are held up by IT. And it became very clear two things. Number one, this infrastructure, if disrupted, doesn't amount to a news story or a letter from a credit card company. It's something you need to live, doesn't work anymore. I do a lot of public speaking, and I talk about the difference between, getting another letter from a credit card company and we're going to monitor your credit for free for the 29th time versus my toilet wouldn't flush for 3 days. Or I called a hospital call center and it didn't work. There is a real difference in the impact to our lives because of the scale of those two things. And so the company exists really to serve what we call critical infrastructure at the local scale. And really, it's primarily the health sector, because if there's one thing you don't want to see get knocked over, it's your local hospital. They're on the ropes anyway, and man, they need help. So we're here to help them.
It's amazing. I mean, one of the reasons I changed my intro and said not the original recovering healthcare CIO is because Direction Ford works pretty closely with you guys.
Yes, he does.
He is the original recovering healthcare CIO.
He's still in recovery.
Still in recovery. So, today's topic is going to be cybersecurity. I love that intro because, a lot of times we're talking about, we talk about the incident in terms of, PR and, getting out in front of the message and a breach of medical records. And none of those are really at the heart of running the hospital per se. But there's still a lot of incidents we need to worry about that would actually shut down the hospital, I would think.
Yeah, well, increasingly, it's there's a lot of weird things going on. There are nation states that are disguising their operations as organized crime, some with the intent to steal. North Korea is known to be ripping off banks to fund their weapons of mass destruction program. And you're not really sure who you're dealing with and what their capabilities are anymore. and we've reached a point where the organized crime business, and it's a business, has sought out the low-hanging fruit, and unfortunately, that's a lot of poorly protected hospitals. In addition to the annoyance of organized crime and the potential to patient care there. There are things going on like the Chinese government has just come out and said, we are really interested in cancer research data. And sure enough, the campaigns have started to infiltrate research organizations to steal intellectual property, cancer research data. So there's a variety of actors here. I think the ones that we hear about in the news really is around, the dreaded records breach. Everybody thinks that's the worst thing that can happen. It is not. And frankly, the conversation, and you hit on this a little bit, the conversation to have with executives, boards of directors, et cetera, is not about, scary Russian cyber buffer overflow SQL injection. It's good to ground yourself in the outcomes you want to avoid and manage the risk around those. And there's a language and there's math around this. And if you have the right kind of conversation, you move that needle a little better.
So we're gonna, as sort of our muse for this conversation, you're gonna be the CISO, I'm gonna be the CIO. We're gonna be essentially going to a board, and we're gonna be doing a presentation to help them understand it. And we're also gonna be talking about, we're gonna be asking for money. And so we're going to identify some of the things we would ask, but just to level set. I mean, we had, a couple stories just this week. 32 million patient records have been breached in the first half of 2019. 32 million. 88% of those are caused by hacking. The HIPAA fines for 2018 alone are close to 30 million for hospitals. These can be breaches of providers, business associates, which is a little harder.
Yep.
The hospital is one, but now you have to worry about the systems of the people you're connected to, and then payers. The Anthem 2015 breach was massive. And whenever you see a chart, you see this massive spike, and you're like, what happened there? And it was Anthem and their breach. And I think what it shows is that no one's really immune, and incidents appear to continue to be increasing. So we're going to be going in front of the board. How do we get them up to speed on cybersecurity? You would think that everyone is up to speed, but there's so much confusion still.
Yeah. Well, my first tip is don't talk about cybersecurity. Talk about these things, these outcomes that we want to avoid, which would impact the mission of the covered entity, which is patient care. You could fairly put these outcomes into 3 buckets, and I'd even reduce it to 2, but let's use 3 because we pulled out records disclosure as this particularly nasty thing, that we'd focus on. So bucket number 1 is unauthorized disclosure of protected records, right? The records breach, and this happens all the time, every day. You brought it up yourself. This is bad. It has a cost associated with it. We know what that cost is. The Ponemon Institute has done lots of research into this, and we know that the cost of cleaning up after unauthorized disclosure of records, given fines from the Office of Civil Rights, from potential brand damage, from compliance with the state's data breach reporting statute, for hospitals, this ends up being somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 a record. So, just simple math. If we're talking about the potential risk from records disclosure, we have 1 million records in a database that meet the definition of personally identifiable information, protected health information, what have you. There is a potential liability of $400 million there. That's how we start this conversation. We start talking about the amount of liability that is around, these pots of gold. So number 1 is unauthorized disclosure of protected records. Number 2, theft and extortion. We call it ransomware. We use dumb names in the cyber business, starting with the word cyber. Theft and extortion, we see empirically about how much this is worth, right? Ransomware does an extortion on a hospital. Business email compromise just fools somebody into sending money away, and we can kind of know what the magnitude of that is. So we start to put dollar signs around these outcomes rather than talking about, hacking. And I would actually take some issue with that word hacking because it's really unspecific as to what that was. There's a difference between I fooled you into giving me your password and I walked into your network versus I packaged some exploit and figured out how to get somebody to bite on something really exotic that will fly under the radar. Those things are different. But you can call them both hacking. So a little specificity there. I read the same article you did, and I thought that was remarkably unspecific. But moving on, records disclosure, theft and extortion, and then the third one is just disruption of critical services. And disruption for the sake of disruption is also a growing trend. And so when we're talking about things like the Internet of Things and medical devices that are vulnerable, the fact that if you attach a camera to the Internet and you haven't done even the basics of changing the default credentials, it'll be taken over in 90 seconds and weaponized for other purposes. So, if that impacts your continuity of operations and your operation is patient care, that's probably the worst outcome right there. The records disclosure is going to be, a kind of, interesting historical memory if the ability for a hospital is intentionally disrupted and there is no ransom to pay, there is no way to get it back, and it's just rebuild. So that's how I would start the conversation. I would talk about these exposures, the dollar signs that are associated with them, and then talk about the two terms in risk, lowering the likelihood of those outcomes and lowering the impact of those outcomes if and when they occur, because these are fairly foreseeable events, to your point, in today's world.
Well, so that leads me in two directions. One is, part of me wants to have us put on black hats and say, okay, how are we getting in? Because that's going to be one of the questions they ask us, is like, how are people going to get in? But the other thing is, when you have conversations like that with the board, they immediately go to risk. They go, risk? Oh, I know how to mitigate risk. Let's get insurance. And then when this happens, we lean on that cyber liability policy. And, first of all, you're not going to get a fine for $400 million, because the federal government's job is not to put you out of business unless you're grossly negligent. And for the most part, they need you providing care in the communities that you're serving in. So those fines end up coming down pretty significantly. They could have easily put Anthem out of business.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just do the numbers. And so to a certain extent, we have to educate the board on more than just, hey, there's a risk, there's a financial risk, there's a lot of other risks associated with it. So let's put on our black hats for a second, or let's be white hat hackers, I guess. How are we getting in? I mean, the easiest is through people, right?
Right, absolutely. It's, fooling somebody is a time-honored tradition. And if I can get you to give me your password so that I can just march into your network, maybe implant some kind of malware that's, put it on your computer, because now I have access to it, and start a ransomware event or something like that in order to extort the hospital.
So what are we going to do?
Credential theft is rampant right now.
Are we closer to the point where people don't even know their own password, but they can still get into systems?
Yeah, we're getting there, honestly. In fact, some of the controls that we use in order to administer our customer premise equipment, right? The collection device we put on a customer network to hoover up a bunch of security events and send them to analysts. When our analysts have a need to actually make a connection to those, they don't know the password. And we do this, they use one-time passwords that are not good anymore. Right? So there are ways to do this, and I think we're getting to the point, I don't know if you saw a story today, Amazon is experimenting with completely facial and bio-authentication methods rather than anything else. So you walk into one of their stores, you're already recognized, they have your credit card on file, and that's that. So, I think it's being led by, big corporations in the private sector, to increase retail businesses, but these methods are going to be pervasive sometime very soon.
Yeah, because as long as people know their passwords, they're going to potentially give them away. So that's one of the areas. Another area is people just go into certain websites, and that's another way that this stuff gets transferred, right?
It is, but I would make a distinction here, because there is a difference between a targeted attack, an actual attack where somebody did some research and they penetrated your organization on purpose with the intent to steal records or to extort you, versus somebody visited a website today that was bad when yesterday it was okay. That is the background noise of the internet. And tripping over the background noise of the internet isn't personal. It's not targeted. It wasn't meant for you. And there is a difference there. But yes, that is actually another way that's fairly prevalent is it's called, just a drive-by attack. You hit a website. Now, there are times when there are websites that are known to be frequented by a certain sector or another. I'll just pick one out of the air. The Becker's Hospital site. I know the kind of people that visit that site. And so if I can compromise that site so that the visitors then are compromised with whatever malware I throw at them, I'm pretty sure I've gotten people in hospitals. That's called a watering hole attack. So that's out there too. But I think it's good to distinguish, because the motivation of the threat actor is something that we need to keep in mind here when we're talking about risk. And just let me respond really quickly to the issue of insurance. I live in Seattle. We don't insure against rain. It just happens all the time. It is a foreseeable event. Could a hurricane happen here? Well, yeah, you know what? It's not outside the realm of possibility. It could happen. So when you identify risk, there's 4 ways to handle it. You can completely avoid the risk. You say, we're just not going to do that thing that's risky anymore. You can accept the risk, right? The 1971 Ford Pinto method of risk management. They blow up. We know it. We'll just pay people off. We don't want to fix them. You can mitigate that risk through the application of controls, and this is where we ask for money, or you can transfer it through risk. Transferring your risk using insurance should be done at the end after you've done those other 3 things, and that's residual risk. You're not going to be able to keep out a nation state if they want to steal your cancer research. They're going to be able to do that. That's the hurricane that you should insure for. Soapbox off.
Interesting. So let's talk about intentions. So a majority of these are still financially related. Is that what I heard you say earlier? It's organized crime and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, for the most part, it's still organized crime, and the value of a health record is pretty clear.
So and nation, because when you're sitting on a board, they'll sit there and go, well, if China wants in, they're getting in, and they sort of throw up their hands, and you're like, okay. Yes, but we also have to keep the kid who's studying at UC Irvine from having it just because he just learned a new way to do it. And we also have to keep, the threat actors that we know we can keep out. We need to keep them out. So if somebody's intent is money, all right. So let's sort of put these things on a scale. We have the kid in his basement who's just learning how to hack and who thinks it might be interesting. And then we have nation states.
Yep.
What can we really protect against, and what are we going to just struggle to protect against?
Sure. So I'm gonna take this back to our expression for risk, right? The likelihood of a bad event multiplied by its impact, and that impact should really be dollar signs there. So you buy down the likelihood of a bad event using preventive controls, firewalls, URL filtering, email security, antivirus. There's all kinds of stuff. Train your employees, do vulnerability. All those are designed to make bad things not happen, and they will fail against a determined actor. But as you build up that preventive control strategy, you're raising that risk bar so that the unsophisticated actor of opportunity is no longer a problem. And then maybe insiders are no longer a problem. And we've got pretty good controls there. And then hacktivists, and I don't think the health sector is really have too much of a problem with hacktivists. They used to crawl up my backside all the time when I was at the city of Seattle. But let's just keep our risk bar going. Organized crime is fairly sophisticated and has tools, techniques, and procedures that we can defend against. And then we're getting up into nation state and terrorist space up there. We can raise that risk bar through the combination of accept, avoid, mitigate through controls, and transfer through insurance, and get that bar pretty high. What we then need to accept, admit, and embrace is the fact that bad events will happen that start the process of records disclosure, theft and extortion, and service disruption, but they can be stopped before any of those outcomes occur. If a workstation is compromised and you see the signal of this because you're monitoring your network and you know that workstation has never talked to Ukraine before, what's up? And you go pull the wire on it, it's a tree falling in the forest. You didn't lose any records. Your money's not stolen, nothing. So that's a focus on the impact term, not the likelihood term. And so the way that you buy down impact is through the application of good monitoring, detection, and frankly, more importantly, effective and rapid response. Put the little fire out before the house catches fire, and there is no report to OCR, there is no brand damage, there is no fine, there's none of this. And so focusing on both of those sides of the risk expression is more of a full-featured way to go about this. And going back to our original premise here, having that conversation with the people that fund the controls.
So we want to monitor, detect, and respond pretty rapidly. Are these tools getting more sophisticated? Because, you know, it's when I think about it, okay, so they've gotten in, they're into the EHR. How long is it going to take them to exfiltrate 1 million records before we're looking at it? I mean, are the tools sophisticated enough that we're seeing it pretty quickly and being able to respond and unplug it that quick?
Yeah, the tools are getting sophisticated. You know, it's you know, we're led to believe that if we just keep buying tools, they are becoming more and more magic. And the root cause of that is the lack of people that we have to fill these roles, to be security analysts and security engineers, et cetera, et cetera. They're in short supply, they're very expensive, and I can tell you with a good deal of authority, they're rather flaky. They can change jobs every 6 months and double their salary, so they will. So, you know, venture capitalists smell blood in the water here. So if, you know, you got a 3-slide PowerPoint deck talking about your magic technology, you can probably get funded. So that's how we're kind of, you know, we got AI coming out of the woodwork and machine learning and orchestration and automation and all of these promises that you don't need to rely on people anymore. Somewhat paradoxically, when you keep buying these tools, you have to throw more and more people at them to get them to work. And so you have achieved an outcome that is exactly the opposite of the one you intended. However, it is true that the ability to monitor your network for aberrational events is becoming better and better and better. There's something, let's call it last decade's new thing. It was called UEBA, right? User and Endpoint Behavioral Analysis, by where we build up a baseline of what's your average behavior. And when you do something, you being a computer, it can be a camera, you know, it can be lots of things. When you do something that's 2 standard deviations from your mean behavior, an alarm goes off. Still, there better be a person to receive that and investigate it and make sure that it's not a false positive and you're not about to pull a trigger like, you know, shut down some subnet inside a hospital that's got a whole bunch of insulin pumps behind it or something like that. So the people are still critical. The ability to detect has definitely improved. There are statistical methods, frequency-based methods, behavioral-based methods, signature-based methods, reputation methods. There's all of these things. In fact, we use all of those. So you're pretty good at, you know, identifying those events on a network that should be looked at. You still got to throw some people at this.
You know, we're going to come back to our presentation to the board. And we're going to see if I actually am learning from this process of this conversation. But at what point should we be considering outsourcing, you know, our security practices? Because I made that mistake. I installed a ton of security controls, software, you name it. And then all of a sudden my team was like, look, each one of these things generates this many alerts. This many alerts need to be, you know, gone through, and signal, noise, false positives. And they were like, you know, we need to quadruple our team. Which was never the goal. So is there a point at which you just look at people and go, look, you're either, you don't have the scale to protect yourself and you're going to need to look outside?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean, it's just with respect to, you know, qualified practitioners in cybersecurity, it's a seller's market. And so there are a lot, especially rural hospitals, critical care facilities, things like that, that they do not have access to that market of qualified practitioners. And someday that will not be the case. We in particular, the company, are working on improving the education system in Washington State by monitoring down market cities and counties for free, using the data we collect as curriculum in partnership with a number of universities. But set that aside, we are where we are today. And so it makes a lot of sense. And, frankly, we saw this coming some time ago, to have a focal point for qualified individuals that can be allocated as a service. That creates an efficiency that everybody understands fairly well. There's a difference, and you pointed this out, Bill. You brought up the what we call as alert fatigue. All of these technologies are yakking at us all the time, and there needs to be some way to boil this down to the high value targets for investigation, and then have the ability to confirm and then initiate response so that you effectively put out the grease fire. Now is that day, depending on which part of the sector you're in, right? If you're Kaiser Permanente, you have access to qualified people. If you are a rural hospital in Idaho, and some of those are our customers, not so much. So, one size does not fit all here, but I think the ability to outsource your monitoring, detection, and response is really carving out its own space here in terms of the value proposition for the health sector, depending on where in the sector you are.
Right. So, actually, one last thing before I go back to our presentation. So I hear people say all the time, there's two types of organizations, those that have been breached and those that will be breached. I mean, is that still the case? It seems kind of fatalistic in its...
Yes and no. So there's an interesting term from the legal profession, the standard of foreseeability. And let's talk about all those technologies that are screaming at you all the time. Look at me, something's going on, look at me. There have been a number of instances of executives that had to disappear, Target being a notable example, because they had not adequately resourced the evaluation of all the alerting coming off their technologies, therefore didn't follow it up, and therefore had their behinds handed to them. And because in the legal profession, this standard of foreseeability, and I'll paraphrase this, if you fail to take action to mitigate a foreseeable risk, you are guilty of negligence. And now, this is not the kind of thing you pull out in conversation when you're in the board, but it is something that needs to be part of the conversation. If you want to get an executive's attention, you don't say scary Russians and SQL injection, you say gross negligence.
Right. Actually, one last thing before I go back to our board presentation, and that is, how should, I just got my Equifax thing this morning. Hey, if you're part of this, you're eligible for, protection and a part of a claim, which I'm sure will end up being a $5 check.
Mm-hmm.
How should patients, how should end users be thinking about this? Have we just grown numb? We're just like, look, if they have my Equifax data, they know an awful lot about me already.
Yeah.
How should I be thinking about it?
Well, I think it's a little different for health records. It's true that we've been desensitized to this event, and I joke around saying, there are no records left to steal. When they stole all of the records out of the Office of Personnel Management, they got my SF-86 form and my fingerprints. What else should I worry about, right? But when you are talking about health records in particular, this is a different thing, because this can be used. This can be sold to, for example, and I'm not going to, insinuate that this is occurring. I'm just going to say this is a possibility. Insurance companies could be buying this data out of the black market, and they could be using that to, frankly, manipulate, premium costs and things like that, and potentially denying people claims based on something that they found in a record. So, health records have value over and above what their value on the black market is. And, you think you might have a case of identity theft. which is another dumb word we use in my business. It's fraud. But the thing that keeps coming back to me is we were talking a lot about the confidentiality of records. One thing that's starting to hit the radar more and more is the integrity of records, because if I can steal your records, I can change them. And I can make it say, no, you're not allergic to penicillin in that record. And then you could have a real bad outcome. Okay. So, I'm not saying this stuff is going on. I'm saying this is a threat. So, when we're talking about the desensitization of, frankly, the global population about this issue of records disclosure, I think health records are in a different class because of the potential impact there.
All right, so in the last 5 minutes, let's put our deck together. I hate that we're going to put a deck together. So here's what we're going to say to the board. We're going to say, let me think about this. So we're going to talk to them in terms of what they. Well, first of all, we're going to educate them on what our threats and our risks happen to be. It's like there's those 5 levels that we were talking about in terms of nation states, all the way down to the unintended hacker who happens to get our stuff. I think I want them to understand, hey, you know what? These are the people that are potentially coming in. Here's the risk to us in terms of of events that we should worry about. We should worry about a breach of patient records. We should worry about a potential health incident where somebody is tapping into our Internet of Things and changing something, literally a cyber attack that could be considered a threat on someone's life, I guess, is a way to do it.
That would be the impact. Yep.
So we have to sort of frame up those potential incidents that could happen within our health system, and sort of give them a flavor of what they are, and then what the impact to the health system would be. Right.
Yep. And frankly, what the financial impact would be as well, right? Because when we're talking about extortion, patient care is threatened, but so are the finances of the organization. So, relating all this to impact, which is up to loss of life, I think this is the way to have the conversation. And then, let's estimate how much risk we can knock down by focusing on reducing the likelihood of a bad outcome and reducing the impact of a foreseeable event that could potentially end up one of those bad outcomes, and talking about the amount of funding it will take versus the dollar level of risk that it will have a positive impact there.
So we've educated on them. Then we're going to talk about mitigation strategies. Then we're going to talk about the things we're putting in place, measurement controls and response mechanisms for how we're going to address it. And then we're going to ask for some amount of money, right?
Yep. Yep. And frankly, Bill, I would also make sure that we focus on the very high value actions we can take that will drive more of the problem off a cliff. Okay. So right now, credentials are king. Everybody's, got stolen passwords, or they'll fool somebody into giving up their password. That's phishing, right? Multi-factor authentication makes 98% of that a non-issue. And that is a simple control to put in place. It may irritate some people for a while, but we got to get used to this, right? Especially when we're talking about doctors, researchers, things like that, right? They have a lot of sway in medical organizations, and they may be irritated by that. But this is what we have to do. I would say secondarily, third-party security management is really critical because supply chains are being exploited for access to covered entities. And so that's another place where we need to focus. And finally, yes, we need to improve monitoring, detection, and response so that when an event happens, we make it go away as quickly as possible so that we don't end up with the outcomes that we're trying to avoid. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But what about the downstream partners? What about the business associate that we have? Are we extending our reach out into those business associates?
Well, it's a requirement that we do so, right? It's third-party security management is a requirement of a lot of regulatory statements. But what that usually ends up being is, here's my questionnaire, fill this out. And so we've checked the box. Okay, that doesn't do it. I really had a very interesting conversation recently with somebody who is the CISO of a payer. And this CISO was talking about an idea that I think has a lot of merit. And we're going to drill down on this later when I loop back. How about if that covered entity conducted security monitoring for its supply chain, its business associates, its third parties? So then there's a higher level. Yeah, we got, the checklist and we see what kind of controls they have in place and what their corrective action plan is, but we monitor that network. That doesn't have to be expensive. That can be put together fairly readily with open source tools. And depending on whether or not this particular payer is willing to set up a security operations center to evaluate that stuff, this is actually kind of a good idea. You're making a great point here, right? How much of that management do we do? And so maybe it's time to start having the conversation about, monitoring your own supply chain.
Yeah, and I filled out some of those forms, and I'm sure you've seen some of those forms, and they're almost comical. I mean,
yep, and it's whenever you self-assess, you can bet that a lot of those answers are aspirational.
Absolutely. Well, Michael, thanks for coming on the show, and thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. Is there anything you'd leave our listeners with, or any way to follow you, or additional information?
Yeah, I'll say this. So our site is ci.security, and at .com, just ci.security, and there's a news tag there. And if you sign up for the daily IT security news blast every morning at 5:15 a.m. Pacific time, you'll get somewhere on the order of 20 curated articles with the title, the money quote, and the original link. We don't do creepy tracking. This is just for everybody's situational awareness. This has been going on for about 10 years, and it goes all over the place. There's always a section for the health sector. There's a section for the finance sector. There's government. There's privacy and surveillance. And then there's just a jaw dropper. I can't believe this just happened. So it's a good thing, and that way you can just stay up to speed on what's really current, because we scrape the news every day to put this together.
Fantastic. And I don't promote any one company per se on this show, but if you like Drex and you like Michael, I'm going to give CI Security a call. So.
All right. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. So this show is a production of This Week in Health IT. For more great content, check out the website at thisweekhealth.com or the YouTube channel also at thisweekhealth.com. Right at the top, it says YouTube. Just go ahead and click on that. Thanks for listening. That's all for now.